The lake at Marin Hollow was said, by those who had lived long enough beside it to speak with authority on such matters, to keep whatever it was given. It kept the reflection of the old West Tower long after the tower itself had been pulled down for its stone. It kept the shape of the wooden footbridge that had rotted through in the winter of the Great Flood, and on certain gray mornings, when the mist did not lift until noon, a person walking the far bank could still see the ghost of that bridge on the water, black and neat and useless. It kept the names of 3 drowned boys carved into the stump of the willow, though the willow had been cut down when their mother could no longer bear to walk that way, and it kept, so the older women in the village said, the vows of anyone foolish enough to speak them aloud on its shore. This is the story of a young woman who came to that lake to hide her eyes from a stranger, and in doing so, walked without knowing into the whole of her own life. To understand what she was hiding from, you must first understand what she had already lost, for the two were the same thing wearing a different coat. Her name was Ideny Cleave, and at the hour our story properly begins, she was 27 years of age, which in her country was reckoned late, and in her own reckoning was reckoned finished. She was on her knees at the edge of the water, with her sleeves turned back to the elbow and her hands red from the cold, wringing out a length of gray linen that had been her mother's shroud cloth, and would, before the week was done, be a set of napkins for the parsonage. She had been up since before the first light. She had already fed the 2 hens that were left to her, and swept the flags of the kitchen, and put the kettle on the hook, and taken the kettle off the hook, and set it aside for the tea that she would not have time to drink, and mended the strap of the leather bucket with a piece of harness leather older than she was, and copied out 3 columns of figures into the ledger of the parsonage school, where she was, by grace and by necessity, the mistress of 9 children and the keeper of the accounts. She had done all of this before the sun cleared the hill. It was her habit. It had been her habit for 26 of her 27 years, for she had begun early, and she had continued because there had never been anyone else to begin instead. And the linen at that hour was the last thing she owed the morning, and after the linen she would owe the afternoon its own list, and after the afternoon the evening, and so on to the grave, which she expected without complaint and without eagerness, as a woman expects a coach she has already paid for. She was not thinking, when she knelt at the lake, of marriage. She had not thought of marriage in 9 years. She had once thought of it a great deal, in the season after her father's ruin, when a young clerk in the neighboring town had written her 4 letters in a fair, careful hand, and had then written a 5th letter in a hand less careful, saying that upon reflection and after consultation with those older and wiser than himself, he could not, in conscience, ask a lady to share a purse he was not yet sure he could fill, and remained her most devoted servant. She had answered the 5th letter with 3 sentences. She had thanked him for his frankness. She had wished him well. She had asked him not to write again. And she had then folded the 4 earlier letters into the 5th, and put the whole small packet at the back of a drawer that held nothing else, and she had gone downstairs to help her mother, who was dying of a slow disorder of the chest, and she had not spoken of the clerk to any living soul, and she had not, from that hour to this, permitted herself the indulgence of imagining a different life. Waiting was a thing she had learned to do well, and hoping was a thing she had learned to do without. So when she heard, above the small, clean sound of water dripping from the linen, the further sound of a horse being ridden slowly along the ridge on the far side of the lake, she did not raise her head. She had trained herself, over the years, not to raise her head at the sound of strangers, for strangers, in her experience, brought bills or condolences or messages from town, or the sort of pity that was worse than either, and she had no wish to receive any of these before her hands were dry. She kept her eyes upon the linen. She wrung it out again. She heard the horse stop. She heard the rider dismount. She heard the small, polite noises a well-bred animal makes when its bridle is loosened and its neck is patted, and she heard, more distinctly than she wished, the ring of a boot heel upon the flat white stone that marked the drinking place on the opposite shore. She did not look up. It was, she told herself, no business of hers who came to water a horse at Marin Hollow. It was, she told herself, no business of hers what a stranger might think of a woman at her washing. And it was, above all, no business of hers whether the stranger, having watered his horse, chose to stand a long minute looking across the water at the small figure kneeling in the reeds, or whether he chose to remount and ride on. She did not, therefore, look up. What she did not know, and what the narrator is at liberty to tell you now, since a story is nothing if the audience is not permitted to know a little more than its people, was that the man on the far shore had been standing there for the better part of 5 minutes, and that he was not, as she supposed, some tenant on an errand, nor some tradesman come down from the market road, nor any of the small and legible figures her country was accustomed to producing. He was the new master of the whole valley in which she knelt. He had come into his title 6 months before, upon the death of an uncle he had barely known, and he had been advised by his steward and his aunt and his own private inclination to view the estate quietly, on horseback, without ceremony, before the tenants were told to line the drive, and the vicar was told to prepare a welcome. He had arrived at Marin Hollow that morning by the west road, alone, in a coat neither new nor plain, upon a good sober bay of the sort a country gentleman might ride, and he had been told by a boy at the crossroads that the lake was worth the small detour. And now he stood upon the flat white stone and looked across the water at a woman he did not know, and could not at that distance have described beyond the shape of her shoulders and the red of her hands, and yet he did not remount, and he did not ride on, and he could not, afterwards, when he tried, tell himself why. He was 33 years of age. He had been, until 6 months ago, a serving officer in the northern regiments, and before that, a boy of no particular hopes, third of 4 sons in a house where the first son had been the one who mattered. His name, by the accident that governs such things, was now Alaric Roe, 6th Duke of Corvin, and it fit him as a borrowed coat fits a man who has never worn silk. He had learned in the 6 months of his elevation that a title is chiefly a set of instructions issued by other people. He had learned in the 6 years before that, in a colder country than this one, that grief is chiefly a set of instructions issued by oneself, and that the safest course is to obey them without argument. He had lost, in the winter of the Northern War, a younger brother who had been the only person in the world who called him by his given name without hesitation. He had not, in the 4 years since, allowed anyone to call him by that name at all. He had answered to Sir and to Captain, and lately to Your Grace, and he had answered evenly, and he had gone about the business of the day. And the frost that had begun in him at the news from the north had by patient neglect become a country he lived in rather than a season he passed through. That was the man who stood upon the flat white stone at Marin Hollow. That was the man who did not remount. And that was the man whom Idony Cleave, having wrung the linen a 3rd time to no purpose, decided at last to acknowledge by the simple expedient of shutting her eyes, so that she should not, upon rising, be obliged to meet the gaze of a stranger across the water. She rose with her eyes shut. She turned her back upon the lake with her eyes shut. She gathered her basket by touch, as she gathered everything, being a woman who had learned in the years of her mother's blindness to know the weight of a handle in the dark. And she walked, still with her eyes shut, 3 careful steps up the shingle, and only there, safely turned away, did she open them again upon the familiar path home. It was a small piece of pride. It was the sort of small piece of pride the poor keep in place of larger ones. She had not, she told herself, given the stranger the satisfaction of a look. She had not begged, by the smallest inclination of her head, to be noticed or pitied or spoken to. She had, in her own quiet ledger, closed the account before it could be opened, and she walked home through the beechwood by the shorter path, and she put the linen upon the line behind the parsonage, and she went in to her 9 children, and she taught them their sums for an hour, and their letters for an hour. And she did not, all that day, mention the horse upon the ridge, nor the boot heel upon the stone, nor the peculiar difficulty she had experienced upon reaching her own door, in remembering the number of stitches required to mend a torn cuff. And the stranger, for his part, mounted at last and rode on, and told no one, that day or the next, what he had seen at the lake, and could not have said, if asked, what it was he had seen. Beyond a pair of red hands and a shut face and the small clean dignity of a woman who had refused to be looked at. But everything that came after began in that hour. To understand what came after, you must go back further still, for the debt that Idony Cleeve owed the world, and the debt the world owed her in return, had not begun with her, and could not be settled without going back to the beginning of it. Her father had been Thomas Cleeve, called Honest Tom by the men who drank with him, and Honest Cleeve by the men who lent him money, and the 2 sets of men had not in the end agreed as to what the word had meant. He had been a small country attorney with a clean office in the town of Welford, 10 miles from Marin Hollow, and a fair reputation, and one weakness, which was a wholly sincere belief in the goodness of an older cousin who lived in London, and who wrote him, twice a year, letters full of opportunities. The opportunities had, in the course of 11 years, become a mortgage upon the house, and a further mortgage upon the office, and at last a debt so intricate that when honest Tom Cleeve died of a stroke at his own desk with his pen still in his hand, the intricacy was found to be, upon careful unpicking, a plain and ordinary ruin. He had signed what he had been told to sign. He had trusted what he had been told to trust. He was not, said the men who took the house, a bad man. He was only a man who had not sufficiently examined the fine print of his own affection. His widow, being already ill, did not long survive the removal from the house in town to the cottage at Marin Hollow that had come to her through her own mother, and Idony, who was then 18, buried her father in the spring and her mother in the autumn of the same year, and set herself, without weeping in the churchyard where it could be observed, to the business of remaining alive. She took the school at the parsonage because the old vicar, Mr. Willem Bray, who had known her father, offered it to her with the same tact with which he offered communion to the shy. She kept the cottage because it was the only roof she had. She kept, in a locked box that she did not open, a bundle of her father's letters to the London cousin, and one letter of the cousin's in reply, in which the cousin, with an ease that had made her hands cold when she first read it, referred to certain sums as being safely lost in the confusion, and to certain signatures as being, happily, in Tom's own hand. The cousin's name was Everard Sewell. He was a small, tidy, tired man who had spent 30 years apologizing for the ambitions of others and had none left of his own, and he had, upon the ruin, sent Idony a formal note of condolence upon black-bordered paper, and had not written to her since. She kept the letter she had never answered. She did not know, and could not have known, that the London cousin, having outlived his cleverness, was at that very hour employed as under-steward at the great house of Corvin, and had for 11 years kept the accounts of the estate with an exactness that would have astonished her father, and that his exactness was of the particular kind that arises when a man is arranging small sums to cover a larger one, and that the larger one had begun, in a small way, with the money that had drained honest Tom Cleave of everything he owned. This is the second thing you are permitted to know, and the characters are not. The under-steward at Corvin was the cousin who had ruined her father, and the new master of Corvin was the man on the ridge above the lake. And these two facts were sitting, at that hour, in the same house, and neither of them knew what the other was, and Ideny Cleave, who alone in the world could have told them, was walking home with her eyes upon the path, and her mind upon the number of stitches in a cuff. We shall come back to Everard Sewell. We are required, by the shape of the story, to come back to him. But we must first return to the lake, for the man on the ridge did not, as he supposed, ride away from Marin Hollow. He rode into it. He rode, that afternoon, to the parsonage upon the advice of the same boy at the crossroads, who had told him that if he wished to know the temper of the valley he should speak to old Mr. Bray, who had been vicar there since before the boy's father was born, and who, moreover, had the only decent claret within 12 miles. The Duke, being a plain man in a plain coat, was received at the parsonage door by an old servant who took him for a traveller in need of directions, and led him, by the shorter passage, past the schoolroom, where 9 children were reciting, in a small clear chorus, the multiplication of 7. He stopped in the passage. He did not know why he stopped. He was not, as a rule, a man given to stopping in passages. But he had heard, above the chorus of the children, a woman's voice correcting a boy who had said 49 when he should have said 63, and the voice had been very quiet and very level, and had contained no impatience whatever, and had, at the end of the correction, said, "Thank you, William. Try again," in the flat, even tone that is only held in place by effort, and he had known, without being told, that this was the woman he had seen upon the shore. He did not enter the schoolroom. He allowed the old servant to lead him on. He was shown into Mr. Bray's small book-lined study, and he drank a glass of the promised claret, and he heard from Mr. Bray a great deal about the parish, and rather less about the estate, and he asked, at last, in a voice he tried to keep neutral, who taught the children. Mr. Bray, who was old but not blind, and who had known Ideny Cleave since she was a child running under his study window, looked at his guest a long moment over the rim of his glass, and answered, in a tone that was itself a piece of information, that the children were taught by Miss Ideny Cleave, the daughter of an honest man who had died in trouble, and that she had done it, alone, for 9 years, and had never, in the whole of that time, missed a morning, or asked for an increase of her wage, or accepted the small charities that the more genteel of the parish had, from time to time, attempted to press upon her, and that if his guest were a stranger to the valley, as he appeared to be, and if his guest had business, as he appeared to have, at the great house of Corvin, then his guest could do worse than remember the name, for the woman was formidable, said Mr. Bray, in the exact tone in which another man would have said the woman was dear, and he set down his glass, and he looked into the fire, and he added, more quietly, that she had been more nearly a daughter to him than his own daughter, who had married into a manufacturing town and did not write. The Duke thanked him for the claret. He asked no further questions. He rode back to the great house by the long road, and he did not tell his steward that he had been to the parsonage. He told his steward instead that he wished, upon the following morning, to see the accounts of the estate for the last 11 years, in full and unabridged, and beginning with the rent books of the Welford properties, of which he had been informed there were several. His steward, whose name was Everard Sewell, bowed. His steward's hand did not shake as he bowed. His steward's hand had not shaken, in 11 years, at any request of any master, and it did not shake now. But his steward, going back that night to the small, neat lodging that had been provided for him in the West Wing, sat a long time at his desk with a candle and a ledger before him, and did not open the ledger, and when at last he opened it. He opened it not at the current year, but at the year 11 years past, and he read a certain page, and he closed the ledger, and he snuffed the candle, and he sat in the dark. We will take a very short break here. If you are enjoying this story, please take a moment to subscribe so you will not miss what happens next. There are stories that begin in the wound and stories that begin in the debt. And there are stories, rarer than either, that begin in the small, careful lie a decent man tells himself in the dark, and it is with such a lie that the middle of our story properly opens. Everard Sewell, sitting in the dark of the West Wing, told himself, that night, 3 things. He told himself that the young master, being new, was only performing the exercise of a new master and would tire of ledgers before he came within 8 years of the truth. He told himself that the sums he had, over the years, moved between columns were sums he had moved for the good of the estate as much as for his own, and that no one had in any real sense suffered, since the estate itself had never lost by his hand. And he told himself, thirdly and most quietly, that Tom Cleeve had, after all, signed the papers of his own free will, and that no man is bound to protect a cousin from his own trust. He told himself these 3 things, and he was, being a decent man in the smaller sense of the word, unable to believe any of them. And he sat in the dark until the birds began, and he did not sleep. The next morning the young Duke received him at 10 in a room that had been his uncle's library and was still smelt of his uncle's tobacco, and the ledgers were brought upon a barrow, and the Duke, who had been trained by the northern regiments in the reading of columns, opened the first of them at random and set his finger upon a line and asked a question. Mr. Sewell answered. The Duke asked another. Mr. Sewell answered. And so for 2 hours, the Duke, in the flat voice he kept for facts, asked and Mr. Sewell answered, and at the end of the 2 hours the Duke closed the book and thanked his steward and said that he would look further himself in the evenings, and that Mr. Sewell need not, in the meantime, alter anything of his usual practice. Mr. Sewell bowed. He went out. He did not, that afternoon, alter anything of his usual practice, for it was too late to alter it without confessing that there had been anything to alter. And he had, in 11 years, forgotten how to confess. He went instead to his desk, and he wrote a letter, and he tore the letter up, and he wrote another, and he tore that up, and at last he wrote a note to his cousin at Marin Hollow, which was the first note he had written to her in 9 years, and the note said only that he hoped she was well, and that he was, upon reflection, minded to call upon her within the fortnight. Upon a matter of family concern, he struck out the word family before he sealed it. He sealed it without the word. And he sent it by the estate boy, and he sat again at his desk, and he began, in the small, precise hand that had cost her father his house, to prepare a set of pages that would, if the young Duke pressed further, appear to answer the questions the young Duke had not yet asked. This is the mystery that will run beneath our story, and I will name it once and shelve it, and I promise to open it again at the proper hour. There is a page in the accounts of the Corvin estate, dated 11 years past, upon which a certain sum was entered as a loan from the estate to a certain attorney in the town of Welford, and upon which the loan was subsequently entered as forgiven upon the attorney's death, and upon which, in fact, no such loan was ever made. And the attorney had, on the contrary, been the source and not the recipient of the money, and the money had gone, by a route that Mr. Sewell could still trace in his sleep, into an investment that had made Mr. Sewell a small competence, and had made honest Tom Cleeve a ruined man. There is that page. It is in the 3rd volume of the rent books. It is on the 17th leaf. It will keep. Meanwhile, at the parsonage at Marin Hollow, Ideny Cleeve received a letter from her cousin Everard, and she read it standing at her own kitchen table. And she read it twice, and she folded it, and she put it into the drawer at the back of which lay the 4 letters from the young clerk, and she went out to feed the 2 hens that were left to her without altering, by the smallest movement of her face, the fact that her heart was beating in her throat. She had not seen her cousin in 11 years. She had wished him at the bottom of the sea for 9 of them. She had, in the last 2, ceased to wish him anything, having discovered that the true wage of hatred is the exhaustion of the hater. She did not know why he wrote now. She had a suspicion, formed in the moment she read the note, that had nothing to do with family concern. And she resolved, standing over the hens with a handful of barley, that she would receive him when he came, and she would give him tea, and she would let him speak, and she would say nothing whatever until he had finished. And then she would say the thing she had been meaning to say to him for 11 years, and she would say it once, and she would say it without raising her voice. She did not know that within a week of the day she formed that resolution, the young Duke of Corvin, sitting alone in his uncle's library, would open the 3rd volume of the rent books at the 17th leaf, and would read the entry there, and would sit very still for a long minute, and would then rise and ring for his horse. It was upon the following Wednesday, at 3:30 in the afternoon, that Alaric Roe, 6th Duke of Corvin, in a plain coat and a plain hat and without any servant at his back, rode down the shingle of Marin Hollow Lake for the 2nd time in a fortnight, and dismounted at the flat white stone, and stood a moment there, looking across at the reeds where he had first seen her, and then walked his horse around the head of the lake and up the beech wood path that led, by the shorter way, to the cottage of Miss Ideny Cleeve. He was not, he told himself, coming to see her. He was coming, he told himself, to make certain inquiries in the village concerning the affairs of a former attorney of the town of Welford, and it was convenient, he told himself, to make those inquiries at the parsonage, and it was proper, he told himself, to acknowledge with a brief call the schoolmistress of that parsonage before he applied to her employer. This is the manner in which the frozen inform themselves of their thaw, by errand and by convenience, and by the recital of proper reasons. He knocked at her door. She opened it herself, being alone in the house, with her sleeves turned back and her hair pushed up with a wooden pin, and a smudge of ink upon her wrist that she had not noticed. And she saw him full in the face for the first time, and did not, in the moment of seeing, know him. She saw a tall, dark, plainly dressed man of about her own generation, with a grave mouth and a set of eyes that were kinder than the mouth, and she saw the good sober bay behind him at the gate, and she saw the coat, which was neither new nor plain enough to be poor, and she stepped back from the door, and she said, in the same even tone with which she had corrected William for saying 49 when he should have said 63, that he had perhaps missed his road. He said slowly, that he had not. He said his name. He did not say his title. He said that he had come from the great house of Corvin upon a matter of accounts, and that he begged her pardon for the intrusion, and that if she could spare him a quarter of an hour, he would be very much obliged. And Ideny Cleeve, who had been prepared, that afternoon, to open her door to her cousin Everard, and was not prepared, that afternoon, to open her door to any other person on earth, looked at him a long moment across the threshold of her own house, and then stepped back and let him in. That was the first threshold. There would be others. She gave him tea in the small front room where her mother had died, and she sat opposite him upon a chair mended with harness leather, and she folded her hands in her lap and said nothing until he had spoken. He spoke slowly. He was not, he said, a man of many words, and he begged her to bear with him. He had lately come into the estate of Corvin. He had lately been examining the accounts of the estate. He had discovered, in the accounts of 11 years past, an entry that concerned her father. He did not, he said, know what the entry meant. He did not, he said, ask her to trust him upon a first meeting. He asked only that she consider whether, upon reflection, and at a time of her choosing, she would consent to look at the entry herself, in his presence, at the great house, so that between them they might, perhaps, arrive at the truth of it. She heard him out. She did not interrupt. When he had finished, she asked one question. She asked the name of the steward who had kept the accounts of the estate for the last 11 years. He told her. She did not, upon hearing the name, alter the position of her hands in her lap, nor the level of her voice, nor the small smudge of ink upon her wrist. She said, in the same even tone, that she would come. She said she would come upon Friday, if that suited him. She said she would come alone, and she would come by her own conveyance, and she would come upon the understanding that she was not, by coming, undertaking any obligation whatever to himself or to his house. He said that was understood. He rose. He thanked her for the tea. He did not offer her his hand. He did not, at the door, look back at her as he mounted, though he wished to, and he rode away. And he was, before he reached the head of the lake, aware that his heart, which had been for 4 years an obedient and well-conducted organ, was beating in a manner not sanctioned by any of the instructions he had ever issued to it. And Idoni Cleave, closing the door upon him, went back to the small front room and sat down again in her mother's chair, and looked for a long minute at the smudge of ink upon her wrist, and then, without hurry, went to the drawer at the back of which lay her father's letters, and drew them out for the first time in 9 years, and read them, and put them into a clean cloth, and set them upon the table by the door, ready for Friday. So the bargain, if it may be called a bargain, was struck that a stranger should ride out on horseback, and a schoolmistress should ride in a cart, and that the two of them, at a table in a library that smelt of tobacco, should sit down together over a book, and look for the truth of a page written 11 years before. She named to herself no feeling whatever concerning the stranger, and she disclaimed, in the small stern court of her own mind, any interest in him beyond the interest of the plaintiff in the presence of the judge. He, for his part, told himself that he owed his tenants an honest set of books, and that this was the whole and the sum of the matter, and that he had ridden out to Marin Hollow upon estate business, and estate business alone. Neither believed themselves. Neither confessed the disbelief. It is the way of proud people to strike bargains with themselves in language they know to be false, and to keep the bargains all the same, because the language, false as it is at least their own. Upon Friday she came. She came at 10, in a cart drawn by a gray pony borrowed from the parsonage boy, in her best plain gray gown and a bonnet that had been her mother's, and she came alone, and she was received at the door of the great house, not by the young duke, who had thought it wise to remain in the library, but by Mr. Everard Sewell, who had been given no warning of her visit. He saw her step down from the cart, he saw her cross the gravel, he saw her stop and look up at the front of the house that had, in a manner of speaking, been paid for with her father's ruin. And he saw her, in the moment she looked up, take a breath, and set her mouth. And come on. He met her at the top of the steps. He had time, in the seconds between recognizing her and greeting her, to consider his position, and he considered it as a man of 11 years' practice considers such things, coldly, and he chose, coldly, to greet her as a distant cousin whom he was delighted to see, and he offered his hand. and he said her name. She did not take the hand. She looked at him a long moment, in the level way in which she had looked 3 days before at the young Duke upon her threshold, and she said, in a voice not raised at all, that she was there upon the invitation of his master, and that she would be obliged if he would show her in. He showed her in. He walked before her down the long passage, and she walked behind him. And she did not look at the pictures upon the walls, nor at the plate upon the sideboards, nor at any of the ordinary evidences of a great house, but only at the back of the small, tidy, tired man who had ruined her father. And she counted her steps as she went, and she reached the number 9 before he opened the library door, and she thought, without triumph and without pity, that it was a suitable number. The Duke rose as she entered. He came forward. He said, in the flat voice he kept for facts, that he had asked Mr. Sewell to attend upon them, since Mr. Sewell had kept the accounts of the estate for 11 years, and might, upon examination, be of assistance. He did not look at Mr. Sewell as he spoke. He looked at Ideny, who understood the arrangement at once, and understood also that the young Duke had understood it long before her, sat down in the chair he offered her, and folded her hands in her lap, and said, in the same even tone she had used at her own door, that she was ready. The book was opened. The leaf was found. The entry was read aloud by the Duke in the flat voice he kept for facts. There was a silence of, by the narrator's count, 7 beats in which no one moved, and the fire in the grate made its small, ordinary complaint, and a bird upon the terrace continued its business, and Ideny Cleeve took from her lap the clean cloth in which she had wrapped, that morning, her father's letters, and set the cloth upon the table and unfolded it. She did not speak. She laid the letters upon the leaf. She laid the letter of Everard Sewell's reply upon the top. She turned it with one finger so that the writing faced her cousin. And she looked at her cousin, and she waited. This is the first stage of the earned trust between our 2 proud people, not a word between them, not a look between them, only the shared act of sitting still while a third person read, in silence, the evidence of his own hand. Mr. Sewell read. He read a long time. He was not, being decent in the smaller sense of the word, capable of pretending that he did not know what he read. When he had finished, he set the letter down. He looked at the fire. He said, in a voice quite unlike the voice in which he had, an hour before, offered his hand upon the steps, that he begged to be permitted to withdraw, and that he would, if it were required of him, place his resignation in the Duke's hands before the day was out. The Duke said gently, and it was the first time in 4 years that he had used that adverb, that Mr. Sewell would not withdraw yet, and would not resign yet, and would sit down, and would answer the questions that Miss Cleeve was about to put to him, and would answer them fully, and would answer them without the smallest attempt at qualification, and that after he had answered them, the matter of his employment would be considered, but not before. Mr. Sewell sat down, and Ideny Cleeve, in the level voice she had learned as a schoolmistress correcting a boy who had said 49 when he should have said 63, began to ask her cousin the questions she had been preparing for 11 years. She asked them without heat. She asked them without adjectives. She asked them as if she were reading, from a list, a set of sums that required to be totaled, and her cousin, who had prepared himself, upon her arrival to weather a scene, discovered that there was to be no scene, and that a scene would have been, of the 2 possibilities, much the easier to bear. She asked him what he had written to her father in the spring of the year before her father died. She asked him what he had received from her father in reply. She asked him for what sum, precisely, he had induced her father to sign, and by what representation, and upon what security, and to whose ultimate benefit. She asked him, at the last, whether he had known, upon the day of her father's funeral, that her mother was already dying, and whether, knowing it, he had considered writing to her, and what, if anything, he had done. And Mr. Sewell, who had spent 30 years apologizing for the ambitions of others, and had none left of his own, answered her, at the last, in the voice of a very small and very tired man, that he had known, and had considered, and had done nothing, because he had been afraid, and that he had, in the 11 years since, been afraid of many things, and had built his life upon the small daily arrangements of that fear, and that he had, upon receiving her at the door of the great house that morning, been afraid still, and would, if she would permit it, be no longer afraid, but only ashamed, which was, he said, a lighter burden than he had known. She heard him out. She did not weep. She had not wept in 9 years, and she was not about to begin, in the library of the great house of Corvin, before 2 men, one of whom she despised, and the other of whom she had not yet decided what to do with. She said, in the same even voice, that she accepted his account, and that she would consider in her own time what she wished to do with it, and that she would, meanwhile, permit him to go about his day. He rose. He bowed. He went out. He closed the door behind him with the careful softness of a man who fears his hand will shake and does not wish it to be heard. And Edony Cleave and Alaric Rowe were left alone, for the first time, in the library that smelt of tobacco, with the 4 letters and the ledger upon the table between them, and a fire in the grate, and a bird upon the terrace continuing its business. He did not, for a long minute, speak. When he spoke, he did not offer her sympathy, for he had already learned in a fortnight that she would not accept it. He said slowly, that he was in her debt. He said that he did not know, yet, in what coin the debt could be paid, and he did not ask her to tell him, but he begged her to believe, upon the little acquaintance they had, that he would not consider it discharged by any short measure. She looked at him a long moment. She said, in a voice not quite so even as before, that he owed her nothing, and that whatever wrong had been done by a small, tired man, and not by him, and that she would not accept the debt of another upon her cousin's account. He heard her out, he said gently again, that she had misunderstood him, and that he had not been speaking of her cousin's debt. She did not answer at once. She looked at the fire. She looked at the letters upon the table. She looked, at last, at him, and she said, in a voice that was quite steady, that she would be glad of a glass of water. That was, in the ledger of their acquaintance, the first thing she ever asked of him. He rose, and he poured her the water himself from the jug upon the sideboard, and he brought it to her, and she drank it, and she set the glass down upon the table beside the letters, and she looked at the glass, not at him. And she said that she must go, and that she would come again, if he wished it, upon the matter of the accounts, and that she would prefer, upon her next coming, that Mr. Sewell should not be present until she asked for him. He said that would be as she wished. He walked her to the door. He handed her into the cart himself, though the groom was there, and he stood upon the gravel a long minute after the cart had gone, and he did not, that day, ride out again, but sat in the library until the light failed, and he did not order candles, and he did not send for supper, and he thought, for the first time in 4 years, of his brother, and of the northern country, and of the name he had not permitted himself to hear, and he did not, upon thinking of these things, feel the customary cold, but a new and unfamiliar quality of warmth that he did not recognize, and did not, therefore, name. So began the slow accretion of their acquaintance. She came to the great house, upon his invitation, once in each week, upon a Friday, in the borrowed cart, and she sat with him in the library, and they went, page by page, through 11 years of the accounts of the Corvin estate. He asked, she answered from the letters. She asked, he answered from the books. Mr. Sewell was, at her instruction, kept at his desk in the west wing, and every alteration that he had made to the accounts over the 11 years was, at his own hand and under her scrutiny, entered in red ink in the margin, and beneath each entry, in his own hand, the true figure that ought to have stood there, and beneath the true figure in his own hand the name of the party to whom the difference had gone. So that at the end of 8 months there existed, in the library of Corvin, a second set of books that told, honestly, the story that the first set of books had lied about for 11 years. That was one thing they built together. There were others. There was the schoolroom at Marin Hollow, which the Duke, having ridden down one Wednesday in November, upon the pretext of inspecting a boundary hedge, discovered to be roofed with a thatch too old to keep out rain, and there was the roof of the parsonage, which the Duke, having inspected the schoolroom, discovered to be in the same condition, and there was the small bridge over the mill stream, and the wall of the churchyard, and the cottage of an old woman named Hebel at the top of the village, whose fire, upon a certain wet afternoon, the Duke was seen to mend himself, in his shirt sleeves. Having sent his groom away upon an errand, and having remained, in the small dark room, to hear the old woman out upon the subject of her son, who had died in the northern regiments in the same winter, and by the same fever, as the Duke's own brother, and the Duke, hearing this, did not name his brother, but sat in the small dark room for an hour after the fire was mended, and drank a cup of the old woman's poor tea, and paid for it with a shilling that he pretended to find upon the floor, and rode home in the rain, and told no one. It was, of course, told anyway, for humble people, being always the true chorus of any parish, tell everything, and by the end of that November there was not a cottage in Marin Hollow that did not know that the young Duke of Corvin had mended Mrs. Hebel's fire in his own shirt sleeves, and that he had, moreover, ordered the roof of the schoolroom, and the roof of the parsonage, and the wall of the churchyard, and the small bridge over the mill stream to be put in order at his own expense, and that he had done all of these things in the same fortnight, and Idonicleve, going from cottage to cottage upon her own errands, was made to hear of them at every threshold in the words of the person who had heard of them last. She heard, and she said little. She was, at that season, going about the business of her days as she had always gone about it, with her sleeves turned back and her lists in her head, but there was a difference in her that only she was in a position to observe. And she observed it with a kind of dry, careful surprise, as a woman might observe a plant that had begun, in the wrong month, to flower. She caught herself, one morning, looking at her hands, and thinking that they had not been red at the lake that day, because of the cold alone, but because she had not slept well the night before. She caught herself, another morning, arranging her hair with an attention she had not given it in 9 years, and putting the wooden pin back with the small, hard, honest laugh of a woman who is not, upon consideration, going to permit herself to be foolish. She caught herself, at last, upon a certain Friday in December, upon the road home from the great house, remembering not the pages they had read that afternoon, but the way in which he had, at a certain moment, set down the pen he was using, and had not picked it up again for the space of some minutes, and had, in that space, looked at her across the table in a manner that she could not, upon reflection, describe to herself in any language that was not the language of a woman being looked at. And she stopped the cart upon the road, and she sat still a long minute, and she said aloud to the gray pony that she was, upon consideration, being a fool. The pony did not answer. It was not required to. And Cleave shook the reins and went home, and she went to bed early, and she did not sleep well, and she rose in the morning and made her lists as she had always made them, and she added to the list, in the smallest of hands, the resolution not to attend to the manner in which the Duke of Corvin set down his pen. The resolution held for 4 days. On the 5th day, she went out at dusk to the beechwood to gather kindling, and she met him upon the path. He had been, he said, riding down to inspect the mill bridge, and had thought, since he was so near, to leave word at the parsonage. He had in fact left no word at the parsonage. He was not at that hour near the mill bridge. He was standing in the beechwood at dusk, with a small bunch of the last late blackberries in one hand, which he had, in the moment of her appearing, put behind his back in the manner of a man of 33 caught, doing something he could not adequately explain. She saw the movement. She did not, aloud, remark upon it. She said, in the level voice, that she was glad she had met him, since she had been meaning, for some days, to ask him a question upon the matter of Mr. Sewell, and that if he would walk with her a little way she would put it to him. He fell in beside her. They walked. She asked her question, which was a question about the disposition of the small competence that Mr. Sewell had made from her father's ruin, and whether, in the Duke's opinion, it might be lawfully claimed, and if it might, whether it ought to be claimed, and by whom, and to what end. And he answered her, walking. And they walked so long over the question that the dusk deepened, and the beeches went from gray to black, and a small owl began to call from the far edge of the wood, and at a certain moment, when the light had gone from her face, and he could no longer see her clearly, he said, quite abruptly, that he did not know why he had brought the blackberries. She said quietly, and without turning her face towards him, that neither did she. They walked on. He did not offer her the blackberries. He did not throw them away. He carried them, at his side, and when at last she stopped at the edge of the wood, at the point where the path became her own path, she held out her hand, and he put the small bunch into it, and she wrapped it in her handkerchief, and put it into her basket, and said good night, and went home. She sat that night at her kitchen table with the handkerchief unwrapped upon the boards, and she looked at the blackberries a long time, and she did not eat them. She put them at last into a small bowl upon the window-sill, where they would, she told herself, be seen by the parish boy in the morning, and she went to bed, and she did not sleep, and when she rose, she took the bowl down, and she carried it out to the hens, and she gave them the blackberries, and she went to the parsonage, and she taught her 9 children their sums for an hour, and their letters for an hour, and she did not, all that day, mention the beechwood, nor the owl, nor the small dry laugh with which the Duke at parting had said her name, for at the edge of the wood, before he handed her the fruit, he had said her name, not her surname, and he had said it as if he had not known, until that moment, that it was a word he was permitted to say. That was the first-hand naming. It was the smallest possible naming. It was Miss Ideny, said quietly, not the given name alone, but the given name preceded by the honorific she had earned, and it was enough, in the ledger of their acquaintance, to be entered in a fresh column of its own. There were other columns. There was the first time she came to the great house in weather, bad enough that he sent his own carriage for her, and she consented. After an argument of exactly 3 sentences, to be brought in it. There was the first time he came to Marin Hollow upon a Sunday, and sat in the parsonage pew, and did not, upon the sermon being ended, walk to the door with Mr. Bray, but stood, instead, in the aisle, and waited, and walked out with her, and did not, in the churchyard, offer her his arm, but walked beside her at a distance that was, to the eye of the village, exactly correct, and, to the eye of Cleave, exactly a hand's breadth closer than it had been the week before. There was the first time he asked her a question that had nothing to do with the accounts of the estate, which was a question about a book she had been reading, and she answered him. And there was, at the end of her answer, a silence of 5 beats that neither of them attempted to fill. And there was, in the middle of March, the first time she asked him a question that had nothing to do with the accounts of the estate, which was a question about his brother, and he answered her, said slowly, and looking at the fire. And he told her, in a set of short and dry sentences, of the northern winter, and of the fever, and of the name he had not been called by since, and of the country of frost he had lived in place of a season of grief. And she listened, and she did not offer him sympathy, for she had already learned in 6 months that he would not accept it, and when he had finished, she said only, in the level voice, that she was glad he had told her, and that she would remember, and that he need not, unless he wished it, tell her again. He looked at her. He did not answer. He nodded once. And that was, in the ledger of their acquaintance, the first entry of a new kind, for it was neither business, nor courtesy, nor the small material kindness of a bunch of blackberries, but the giving of a thing that was not forgiving, and the receiving of it in the language of a woman who had been giving her own such things away, unreceived, for 9 years. It was in the same week that the trouble began. It began in a letter, delivered to the great house upon a Tuesday morning, from a lady of the county named Mrs. Millicent Hollimer, who had been, in her girlhood, a near neighbor of the late Duke, and who had, since the death of her husband, taken it upon herself to consider the marriages of the neighborhood as within the compass of her personal duties. She wrote to congratulate the Duke upon his tenure. She wrote to inquire after his health. She wrote at last and at length to inform him that her niece, a Miss Perpetua Vane, would be staying with her at the Grange for the season of Easter, and that she would consider it a favor if the Duke would honor them with his company at a small gathering upon the Thursday of Holy Week in celebration of the young lady's coming of age. He read the letter twice. He set it down. He knew, having been a younger son and a soldier and now a duke, exactly what such a letter meant. He also knew, having been reading 11 years of the accounts of the estate, that Mrs. Hollimer was one of the larger tenants of the Corvin lands, and that a refusal, unexplained, would be taken as an insult, and that an insult to Mrs. Hollimer would be an insult heard in every drawing room within 12 miles. He wrote his acceptance. He wrote it with the small, dry smile of a man who does not, in general, smile, and he sent it. He did not at once tell Idony. He told himself, in the small, stern court of his own mind, that he did not tell her because there was, in fact, nothing to tell, that the invitation was a matter of tenancy and not of himself, that she would not, in any case, have wished to be consulted upon his engagements. He told himself these 3 things, and he was, being decent in the larger sense of the word, unable to believe any of them, and he sat in the library that afternoon, and did not open the ledger, and when at last he opened it, he did not read it, and when at last he read it, he read the same page 4 times, and he shut it, and he rose. And he went out to ride, and he rode for 2 hours upon the estate, and he came back no clearer, and he sat at his desk after supper, and wrote her a note, and tore it, and wrote another, and tore that, and at last he sent her no note at all, and it was Mr. Bray who told her, upon the Sunday, in the churchyard, that his Grace was to attend the Hollimer Grange upon the Thursday of Holy Week, and that Miss Perpetua Vane, who was said to be a beauty, would be the guest of honor. Idony heard it in the level way in which she heard everything. She thanked Mr. Bray. She walked home. She did not, upon reaching her own door, cry. She did not, upon reaching her own door, take down the wooden pin from her hair and hurl it at the wall, though her hand went twice to her head and twice came away. She went, instead, to the drawer at the back of which lay her father's letters, and she took out the 4 letters of the young clerk from 9 years past, and she read them for the first time in 9 years, and when she had read them, she did not weep over them either, but sat a long minute with them in her lap, and thought, without heat, and without pity, of the young woman who had received them, and of the older woman who had refused, for so long, to open them, and of the still older woman who was, that afternoon, opening them again upon the occasion of a note the Duke of Corvin had not written. She had been, she thought, more nearly a fool this last time than the first. She rose. She put the letters back. She washed her face at the basin, and she went to the parsonage, and she asked Mr. Bray whether he would spare her, upon the Thursday of Holy Week, since she wished to walk to a farm on the far side of the parish, upon a matter of her own. And Mr. Bray, who was old but not blind, looked at her a long moment over the rim of his cup, and said that she might have the day, and any day. She thanked him. She went home. She did not, that night, sleep. She did not, all that week, sleep. She rose upon Thursday morning at the usual hour, and she did her lists, and she walked, as she had said she would, to the far side of the parish upon a matter of her own, and the matter of her own was, in truth, no matter at all beyond the necessity of being 12 miles from the Hollimer Grange upon the day upon which Miss Perpetua Vane came of age. She walked all day. She reached the far side of the parish. She sat a long time on a wall above a field of new lambs, and she watched a hawk turn upon a slow, high wheel, and she came home in the dusk, and she found upon her doorstep a note. It was not from the Duke. It was from Mrs. Hollimer, who had, in the course of her preparations, made certain enquiries regarding certain small matters of history connected with the Cleeve family of Welford, and who, in the fine hand of a woman not writing her own letter, expressed the very deep regret that in view of certain rumors regarding the late Mr. Cleeve, unhappily attached to the name, she had felt herself constrained not to include Miss Ideny Cleeve in the general company at the Grange, but hoped that Miss Cleeve would understand, and would receive this note in the spirit of frankness in which it was written, and remained, in the fine hand of a woman not writing her own letter, her sincere well-wisher. Ideny read the note. She read it upon her own doorstep, in the dusk, still in her walking boots. She read it twice. She did not, upon reading it, cry. She went into the house. She lit a candle. She read the note a 3rd time. And then she laughed, once, a short dry sound that startled the cat, and she folded the note and she put it into the drawer at the back of which lay her father's letters, and she blew out the candle, and she went to bed, and she slept for the first time in 7 nights, and she slept without dreaming. Meanwhile, at the Hollimer Grange, the Duke of Corvin was seated at dinner between Mrs. Hollimer and Miss Perpetua Vane. And Miss Perpetua Vane, who was in fact very beautiful, and in fact very young, and in fact rather cleverer than she was allowed to appear, spoke to him during the fish course of the country, and during the meat course of the weather, and during the sweet course of a hunt she had ridden with her uncle in the north, and the Duke, who had been a soldier, answered her civilly and asked her intelligent questions, and drank his wine slowly, and did not, at any point in the 3 courses, speak the name of Miss Ideny Cleeve, but he thought of her. He thought of her when Mrs. Hollimer raised her glass to the health of the young lady beside him. He thought of her when the ladies withdrew, and the port was brought, and one of the older tenants, who had drunk more than was wise, made a small polite joke concerning the schoolmistress of Marin Hollow, and the roof of her schoolroom, and the whole table laughed, in the smiling, well-mannered, unraised voice-way of country gentlemen who have drunk too much port, and the Duke, at the head of the table, did not laugh. He set down his glass. He said, said quietly, in the flat voice he kept for facts, that Miss Cleeve was the finest teacher and the honestest keeper of accounts in the whole of his estate, and that he counted her friendship among the 2 or 3 things he had gained by his elevation, and that any gentleman who did not agree with him upon that point was welcome to say so plainly, or to be silent. The table was silent. The Duke drank his port. Miss Perpetua Vane, who had lingered a moment in the door of the dining room upon the pretext of a fan she had forgotten, heard him. She turned. She went into the drawing room. She sat down at the piano. She played a piece of her own choosing, which was neither the piece her aunt had asked for, nor the piece the company expected, but a slow air of a kind that country young ladies do not, in general, play in company, and she played it well, and at the end of it she rose and made her aunt her curtsy, and pleaded a headache, and went upstairs, and in her room she wrote a short letter, which she sealed and put by, and she sat up a long time by the window, and she was, upon consideration, a better young woman than her aunt had raised her to be. So the trouble, having begun in a letter, deepened in a dinner, and by the following morning it had put out shoots in every drawing-room within 12 miles. Mrs. Hollimer, whose polite cruelty was of the accomplished kind that requires no raised voice, spoke of Miss Cleeve at teas and at morning calls in the language of regret. And in the language of regret she informed the neighborhood that the young Duke had been, upon the whole, imprudent, and that a schoolmistress, however respectable, was not a wife for a house like Corvin, and that she said this, of course, in the interests of the Duke whom she had known from a boy, and in the interests of the neighborhood, which she loved. She said it many times. She said it so many times that by the end of a fortnight there were fewer people willing to speak civilly to Miss Cleeve in the market at Welford than there had been a month before, and one of the older ladies of the parish, meeting her in the aisle at church, turned her head the exact fraction of an inch by which country politeness is measured, and Idney Cleeve, who had learned, at 18, the exact fraction, saw it and returned it with the exact answering fraction, and passed on. She did not speak of any of this to the Duke. She did not indeed see the Duke, for she had, upon the Friday after the Hollimer Grange dinner, sent to the great house a note in her own small hand, saying that she would be occupied, upon Fridays, for some weeks to come, with an increase of duties at the school, and begging His Grace to postpone their examination of the accounts until such time as she was again at liberty. He received the note. He read it. He read it a second time. He did not reply. He rode, that Friday, down to Marin Hollow, in the plain coat, upon the good sober bay, and he stopped at the flat white stone above the lake, and he stood a long minute looking across the water at the reeds where he had first seen her, and he did not, that day, go on to the cottage. He rode back. He sat in the library. He did not, that week, open the accounts. He did, however, upon the following Monday, send for Mr. Sewell. Mr. Sewell came. Mr. Sewell was, by that season, a smaller man than he had been in October, having spent 6 months entering true figures in red ink in the margins of his own lies, and he stood before the Duke's desk, and the Duke, in the flat voice he kept for facts, asked him one question. He asked what, in Mr. Sewell's opinion, was the true worth, in coin, of 11 years of an honest man's reputation. Mr. Sewell did not answer at once. He looked at the fire. He said, at last, said slowly, that he did not believe such a thing had a worth in coin, and that if it had, he had not the sum. The Duke did not answer. He looked at Mr. Sewell a long moment, and then he said quietly, that he had not asked the question in order to require payment, that he had asked it in order to see whether Mr. Sewell had in 6 months learned the answer, and that since it appeared Mr. Sewell had learned the answer, he would now be permitted to do a thing he had not been permitted to do in November, which was to write, over his own name, a plain statement of what he had done in the year of Tom Cleeve's ruin, and of what part he had had in it, and of what part he had not had in it, and to have that statement witnessed and lodged with a magistrate of the county, and to have a copy of it sent, by the Duke's own hand, to Mrs. Millicent Hollimer of the Grange. Mr. Soule looked at the Duke a long moment. He said that he would write it that night. He wrote it that night. It was witnessed the next morning. It was lodged with the magistrate before noon. And upon the Wednesday of that week, a copy of it, in the Duke's own hand, was carried to the Hollimer Grange by a groom in the Corvin livery, and delivered into the hand of Mrs. Hollimer at her own front door, together with a short note in the Duke's own hand, expressing his Grace's regret that certain rumors regarding the late Mr. Cleeve, unhappily attached to the name, had been allowed to circulate in the neighborhood, and begging her, in the spirit of frankness, to receive the enclosed statement, and to consider whether she would find it agreeable to be informed, at her next call, whether she still felt herself constrained not to include Miss Ideny Cleeve in the general company at the Grange. Mrs. Hollimer read the statement. She read the note. She sat a long minute at her own front hall, in her own chair, with the note in her lap and the statement in her hand, and she was, upon consideration, a woman who had spent her whole life not being answered plainly, and had not, in her whole life, prepared any answer for a plain answering. She rose. She sent for Miss Perpetua Vane. Miss Perpetua Vane came. She was told, in the language of her aunt, what had happened. She listened. When her aunt had finished, she said, in a voice not raised at all, that she had already, upon the night of the dinner, written to a certain gentleman in the north of her acquaintance, and that she would, upon the following morning, be leaving the Grange upon a private matter of her own, and that she hoped her aunt would forgive her, but she did not, upon reflection, think the neighborhood entirely suited her, and she went upstairs, and she packed her boxes. And she left upon the following morning, and she wrote, from the coach, a short note to the Duke of Corvin, thanking him for his civility at dinner, and wishing him, in 3 plain sentences, the happiness that she believed he would not, without a good deal of trouble, otherwise obtain. He received her note upon the Friday. He read it. He was not, being new to his title, a man given to laughing at his desk, but he laughed once, a short dry sound of the kind Ideny had made upon her own doorstep in the dusk, and he rose, and he called for his horse. He rode to Marin Hollow. He did not stop at the flat white stone. He did not stop at the parsonage. He rode directly to the cottage of Miss Ideny Cleeve, and he dismounted at the gate, and he tied his horse to the post, and he walked up the path to her door, and he stood a moment before knocking, and he knocked. She opened the door herself. She saw him. She stepped back, in the small movement of a woman who has, in fact, been expecting a knock for a fortnight, and has, in fact, prepared no answer whatever for the knock now that it had come. She did not, this time, ask him if he had missed his road. He did not, this time, offer any errand. He stood upon her threshold with his hat in his hand, and he said quietly that he had come to speak to her, and that he would say what he had to say once, and would say it badly, and that he asked her to hear the whole of it. She did not answer. She stepped back from the door. She let him in. He did not sit down. She did not sit down. They stood in the small front room where her mother had died, in the last afternoon light of April, with the fire small in the grate, and he set his hat upon the table, and he began. He said that he had come, first, to beg her pardon, that he had not, upon the invitation of the Hollimer Grange, told her at once as he should have done, that he had told himself many false things about his silence, and had believed none of them, and had, in his silence, done her an injury he did not know how to measure. He said that he had come, second, to tell her that Mr. Sewell had at his own hand and over his own name written and lodged with a magistrate a plain account of the year of her father's ruin, and that a copy of that account had been carried to the Hollimer Grange, and that Mrs. Hollimer's polite cruelty was, from this hour, deprived of its material. He said that he had come, third and last, upon a matter that had nothing to do with any of these things, but which had been, in his own quiet ledger, the true reason of every ride he had taken to Marin Hollow since the day in October when he had seen her upon the shore of the lake, and that he had, in 6 months, not permitted himself to name it, and that he would name it now, and would name it once, and would not, whatever her answer, name it a second time uninvited. He said that he was 33 years of age, and that he had been, for 4 of them, a man in a country of frost, and that he had, since the day in October, been thawing, and had not known what he was thawing towards, and had at last understood that he was thawing towards her, that he did not offer her his title, which he set at nothing, nor his house, which he set at little, nor even his estate, which he set at the honest keeping of it, that he offered her, plainly, himself, such as he was, and that he asked her, plainly, whether she would consent, in her own time, and upon her own terms, to consider him. He stopped. He did not add any softening clause. He did not say that he asked nothing of her, he asked, and he waited. There it was. She could answer him or not. She did not at once answer. She looked at him a long minute. She looked at the fire. She looked at the table where her mother had folded, upon a certain afternoon 9 years before, the shroud cloth that Idony had later made into napkins for the parsonage. She looked, at last, at her own hands, which were not, at that hour, red, and she said, in a voice not raised at all, and not level either, but a little unsteady, and continuing all the same, that she had, upon the shore of the lake in October, shut her eyes rather than look at him, and had told herself, upon the walk home, that she had done it out of pride, and that she had, in the 6 months since, been discovering, in small daily instalments, that she had done it out of fear, and that she had, that morning, upon receiving no note from him about the Hollimer Grange, been very nearly ready to shut her eyes again, and to keep them shut, and that she had been prevented from doing so, chiefly by the accident of a cat upon a doorstep and a laugh at a note, and that she was, upon consideration, and after a good deal of trouble, willing to open them. She stopped. She did not say more. He said gently, her given name. He said it without the honorific. He said it once. It was, in the ledger of their acquaintance, the first time he had used the name alone, and he used it as a man uses the name of a country he has been traveling towards for a long time, and has, at last, entered. She looked at him. She said his name in return. She said it as she had, in her own house, in her own hour, prepared herself, without knowing that she prepared herself, to say it, and she said it once. And that was, in the ledger of their acquaintance, the end of the earning, and the beginning of the plain daily practice. He did not kiss her. He held out his hand. She put her hand into it. He held her hand a minute, no more, and he set it down carefully, as a man sets down a thing more precious than he has been trusted with, and he took up his hat, and he said quietly, that he would come again upon the Friday, if she would permit it, and she said that he might come upon the Friday, and he went out. And she stood a long minute at her own door, and she watched him mount. And she watched him ride down the lane, and she watched him turn at the bend, and she watched him raise his hand once, without turning his head, so that the raising was for himself and not for her, And then she went in, and she shut the door, and she sat down at her mother's chair, and she did not, this time, laugh. She sat a long minute in the fading light. She said, at last, in the level voice, to no one, that she must not, upon consideration, be a fool. And then she rose, and she went to the drawer at the back of which lay her father's letters, and she took the letters out, all of them, the 4 from the young clerk, and the 4 from her father, and the 1 from Everard Sewell, and the note from Mrs. Hollimer, and she carried them out into the yard, and she made a small fire of dry sticks, and she burned them, one by one, and she watched them burn, and when they were ash she came in, and she washed her hands at the basin, and she made her supper, and she ate it, and she went to bed, and she slept. They were married in June, in the parish church at Marin Hollow, before Mr. Tyne Bray, in a ceremony of exactly 17 minutes, at which the whole village was present and the whole county was not, and the sermon, being Mr. Bray's, was 2 sentences long, and the second of them was that a marriage begun in earned respect is the only kind that keeps, and that they were, upon his authority, so begun. That was the ceremony. It fits in a paragraph. It should. The reckoning had happened in April in a small front room in the last light, and everything after was only the plain daily practice. Mr. Sewell remained, upon Idane's own instruction, in his post at the great house, upon reduced terms and a reduced salary, and upon the further condition that he should, once in each quarter, ride down to Marin Hollow and take tea with his cousin at the cottage which the Duke had settled upon her, in her own name, upon their marriage. He came. He took tea. He did not at first say much. In the 2nd year he began to say a little more. In the 3rd year he said, upon a certain Tuesday, that he was, upon consideration, tired, and that he thought of retiring. And Idane said that he might, if he wished, retire to a small house at the edge of the village, which she would find for him, and he did, and he lived there 7 years more, and he died there quietly, 1 October, of no particular illness, and Idane walked to his cottage at the news, and closed his eyes with her own hand, and she paid, out of her own purse, for a small stone in the churchyard, upon which she caused to be cut, in plain letters, the name and the date and the words, he told the truth at the last, which was, upon consideration, the whole and the sum of him. Mrs. Millicent Hollimer of the Grange did not, after a certain morning call in May, find the neighborhood entirely as she had known it. She did not, at any morning call, mention Miss Cleeve again. She lived on some years, and grew quieter, and at the end she sent, upon her deathbed, a short note to the Duchess of Corvin, which the Duchess read, and answered civilly, and did not show to her husband, but folded it and put it into a drawer where it lay a long time, and was, at last, forgotten. Miss Perpetua Vane married her gentleman in the north, and wrote, once a year, a plain, sensible letter to the Duke and Duchess of Corvin, and was a good friend to them at a long distance for the whole of her life. Mr. Bray lived 4 years more, long enough to baptize the first 2 of the Corvin children in the same font in which he had baptized Idane, and he died in his own study, in his own chair, with a glass of the estate claret on the small table at his elbow, and Idane was with him at the end, and he called her by her father's name in his last hour, and she did not correct him, and she held his hand. And he died content. The 9 children of the parsonage school grew up. 2 went into service in the great house, and 1 into service at the parsonage. 1 became, in her own turn, the schoolmistress at Marin Hollow, upon the Duchess's own recommendation, and taught, at the same table, 40 years of the parish's children, and never accepted an increase of her wage, and was, in her old age, a small formidable woman, much like her own teacher, and was buried, at her own request, at the Duchess's feet. William, of the 49 and the 63, became a farmer and had 6 children, and was, all his life, careful with his multiplications. Mrs. Hebel at the top of the village lived to be 89, and to the last of her days she told any stranger who came to her door the story of the young Duke and the shirt sleeves and the shilling on the floor. And she told it, always, in the same words, and always with the same quiet pride, and the story, being told so, became one of the properties of the parish. The Duke and the Duchess had 4 children, of whom 3 lived, and the eldest was a girl, and they named her Myrenne, after his brother, in the country of Frost, whom no one had called by his given name for 4 years, and whom his sister-in-law now called by his sister's name at every hour of every day, so that the name was, in a manner of speaking, restored to the world. And the Duke, who had not permitted anyone to call him by his own given name for 4 years, was called by it, in his own house, morning and evening, by his wife, and heard it, morning and evening, in the way a man hears a door being opened that he had thought was shut for good. They lived on. They lived long. The estate prospered under his hand, and the accounts were, from the first year, kept honestly. She kept the school for 3 years after her marriage, and gave it up only when the second child was on the way, and she went, all her life, upon a Wednesday and a Friday, to the parsonage, to sit an hour with the mistress who had come after her, and to hear the children recite their sums, and to correct, when it was required, a boy who said 49 when he should have said 63. Not everything was mended. The years of her father's ruin did not return. Her mother did not return. The younger brother in the country of Frost did not return, and no naming of a daughter, however tender, could bring him back. And some winters, in the great house, the frost still came into the corners of certain rooms. And the Duke sat by the fire at those times more quietly than at others, and his wife did not speak to him then, but only sat with him and mended what was to hand. Some doors stay shut, some hours will not be given back. That is the honest reckoning, and it must be entered in the ledger, or the ledger is a lie. But every year, upon a certain morning in October, the Duke and the Duchess walked, together, without servants, down the beechwood path to the lake at Marin Hollow, and stood together at the flat white stone above the water, and looked across at the reeds. In the first year they said nothing there. In the second year she said, in the level voice, that she had, upon that shore, shut her eyes to a stranger, and he said quietly, that he had, upon that shore, watched a woman with her eyes shut and had not, at the time, understood what he was watching. In the third year they said less than that. In the fourth year they said nothing again. But in every year, upon that morning, she opened her eyes, at the water's edge, and looked at him fully, and he looked at her fully in return, and the lake at Marin Hollow, which was said, by those who had lived long enough beside it to speak with authority on such matters, to keep whatever it was given, kept also the reflection of 2 gray-haired people upon its shore, holding no ledger and carrying no letter, and having, between them, nothing left to hide. It is a small thing to open one's eyes upon another human face and not look away. It is a small thing, and it is the whole and the sum of a marriage, and the pride that shuts them, and the fear that shuts them, are cured, when they are cured at all, not by any grand declaration in any grand room, but by the slow daily practice of raising them, morning after morning, in the presence of one other person, until the raising is easier than the shutting. That is all the moral this story has. You do not choose whom you love by the light in which you first see them. You choose whom you love by the number of times you consent, afterwards, to look. Some are undone by pride, and some by fear, and some by both. but they who are saved by the small, unwitnessed daily kindness of consenting to be seen. Thank you for listening to this story all the way to the end. Tell us in the comments which city you are watching from and what this story made you feel. And do not forget to subscribe so you will not miss the next story.